All right, pre-AP biology. In this video, we are going to continue with our unit on ecology, and we're going to focus on this mainly on population ecology. So, like before, the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about abiotic and biotic factors and ecosystems, and we're going to take a little bit of a different spin on things today. We're going to kind of focus in on not necessarily the ecosystem level, which is what we've been kind of looking at. We've been looking at, again, biotic and abiotic things. But we're going to look more specifically at the population level. Okay. This, I think, is kind of one of the most interesting ways to study ecology is to look at populations of organisms and see how different things affect them. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about with this part of the notes. Before we get into that, let's kind of define again what a population is. This is all the individuals of a species. So, for example, these elephants here, right? These are all members of the same species. They can interbreed, produce fertile offspring. This says that they occupy a certain area at a certain time. So I don't know where this is. I'm guessing someplace in Africa, maybe somewhere in the Serengeti or something. And they're at this specific watering hole. I'm guessing they're all there to drink and cool off and all that type of stuff. But I mean, let's just say that this is a little population, whatever, it might be 10, 15 individuals, but they're occupying this particular area, let's say in the middle of August or something, right? You have a time. Now, if we fast forwarded one year, let's say the following August, would this population of elephants be any different? I mean, would it still be in the same spot? Would they still have the same numbers? Would there be more of them? Would there be more males or females? So, I mean, whenever we study population ecology, what we're looking at is we're looking at things, different factors that cause populations to change. I mean, this elephant population's not going to stay the same forever. I mean, it's going to change. So we're going to study some things that actually can affect populations to change. Now, what I want to look at initially today is just some different characteristics of populations. Now, there's 5 different aspects to a population that we can study. We can look at a population size. We can look at its density. Now, that's different from size. We'll talk about what the difference is in a few minutes. We can look at the distribution, how they're arranged, the individuals are arranged. Sex ratio, which is males to females, how many males are there to females. But we can also look at the age structure. Going back to that elephant, picture, I mean, how many of those elephants were, I don't know, juvenile elephants or baby elephants? How many of them were adults over the age of 50? I don't know. We can look at age structures of populations as well. So let's start off today talking about size. Population size, typically we use a variable, and the variable is a capital N. I'll give you an example here. This is California condors. This is a very large bird. I believe, and I may be wrong about this, but this bird has the largest wingspan of any North American bird, or maybe any bird in the world, but I'm not sure about that. But they're big birds, big wingspans. California condors are interesting because at one time they were extremely endangered. In fact, in 1987, their population size, so here it is, N, it actually got down to 22. There was only 22 birds left in the wild. So the numbers were like super duper low, right? So what we decided to do, what scientists decided to do, was to instill something called captive breeding. Captive breeding is basically where they go out and they round up as many of these birds as they can, and they bring them inside of like zoos and things like that, and they breed them in captivity, and they breed them until the offspring are born, and then eventually they can release them back into the wild. There's a lot of people who think that we shouldn't be doing that. Like humans shouldn't be interfering with nature. I mean, if these animals were supposed to go extinct, then maybe they should go extinct. Some people believe that. Some people believe that what we're doing was the right thing. But the bottom line is their numbers got all the way up to over 300. This was in 2017, but there's actually more than that now. So you can see how the population size changed just through human intervention. Now, one more thing about California condors, if you're kind of on the fence of whether or not we should be, breeding these animals, or should we not be doing that. One of the biggest reasons why California condors are so endangered in the first place is because these birds, because their wingspan is so big, they fly very low to the ground, maybe 20, 30 feet in the air. They don't fly very high. And a lot of times, what ends up happening is they run or they fly into power lines and they get electrocuted or they get entangled in the power lines and they die. So, I mean, that's one of the big reasons why their numbers went down so far was because of things that humans do. So, I don't know. I mean, if humans are one of the biggest reasons why they're endangered, then maybe we could make a case for helping them out a little bit. I don't know, but humans did interfere, and we have brought them back a little bit, at least up to 300 plus. So that's kind of, I guess, a success. Now, when it comes to population size, one thing I want us to understand is that populations fluctuate. They're dynamic. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. We learned that a little bit with the moose and the wolves, right? Um, but I want us to understand what factors influence the change in size. So we have these things called inputs and outputs. Okay, inputs or population inputs are basically ways that new members can come into the population. So let's think about those elephants, right? Let's say that there's whatever 15 elephants, um, but let's say that there's a couple elephants that are born. Let's say 1 year of time goes by. Let's say in that 1 year, two elephants are born. Okay, so we go from let's say 15 elephants to 17 elephants, right? So we have two more. Let's say a couple of other elephants immigrate, from another herd. Let's say I don't know, 4 or 5 elephants come over and join this elephant population that I showed you earlier. So if there's any immigrant elephants that are coming in, that will cause the population to go up. So these two things, both births and immigration, that will cause a population to increase in size. And just the opposite, there's population outputs, right? So, let's say in 1 year of time, I mean, maybe some of those elephants die. So if you have two elephants that are born and two that die, then there really is no change in population size, right? And the same thing too with emigration. Emigration would be an elephant or elephants that leave the group or they leave the population and go somewhere else. Maybe they go to another population or whatever. So these are outputs, right? So the population size is dependent on those four factors, births and immigration, which are the inputs, and deaths and emigration, which are the outputs. And if those four things are all in balance with each other, then the population size isn't going to change at all. But if, for example, your inputs outweigh the outputs, if there's more input than output, then your population size is going to go up. If there's more output than there is input, then your population size is going to go down. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, there's some other things too that kind of impact and influence population size. These are called limiting factors. You might remember back when we did Gauss's experiment. You guys did that, that virtual lab the other day. You might recognize a little curve like this, right? When we're measuring populations over time, right? Just remember the bacteria, for example, right? The bacteria started growing, then they continued to grow, and they grew faster and faster, and then all of a sudden, they started to level off, right? We talked about the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is that amount of individuals that the environment can support. But Think about those bacteria and like why those bacteria were growing, and then all of a sudden they, kind of stopped growing. They kind of leveled off a little bit. That was mainly because they ran out of food. They were running out of living space. They were becoming more, there was just too many of them, right? Well, these things are called limiting factors. Limiting factors are things that can limit how much a population grows or limit the size of a population. You think about things like diseases, space, like how much living space there is, predators, food. This graph is about fish, but it could very well be about elephants or bacteria or humans for that matter, right? I mean, organisms, a population, they grow this way. It's called exponential growth. We'll talk more about that later this week. But eventually, these limiting factors start putting pressure on the population the more individuals there are. Now, if you removed the disease and you removed the predators and gave them all the living space and all the food that they need, then those organisms would continue to grow, right? The carrying capacity line, this line here, this would be increased, if those limiting factors weren't there. So, when it comes to limiting factors, a few things I want you to understand about them. The population size, it can kind of be controlled or it can be limited by all of these factors. And this is just, a small list of them. Things like competition, for example. Competition is a limiting factor. Predation, how many predators there are, that can limit a population. Disease, parasitism. These three things are what we call density dependent. What that basically means is that the more dense the population is, the more individuals there are, the more these things come into play. I mean, let's just say elephants, for example. The more elephants there are, the more likely they're going to be preyed upon by a lion or whatever. The more elephants there are, the more likely there's going to be disease amongst those elephants, right? Because there's more contact with those elements. The more elephants there are, the more competition there's going to be between the elephants, whether it be for mates or for water or whatever it is. So, these are things that can limit the population size, but they become more problematic as the population gets bigger. Now, these things over here, these are called density independent. These are things that are going to affect a population regardless of how big the population is. I mean, like a natural disaster. I don't know. I mean, let's say that there's, I don't know, a tornado or something. I don't know, that rips through the Serengeti. That doesn't really happen very often. But I mean, if there's a natural disaster, or let's say there's a forest fire or something that might impact the elephant population, I mean, that's going to happen regardless of how many elephants there are. I mean, tornadoes and forest fires don't really care about how many elephants there are. They're just going to happen, right? Unusual weather, same type of thing. So, I mean, these things are density independent. But again, they all, I don't care what they are, dependent or independent, they can limit a population size. They can affect that carrying capacity. All right, so just to kind of summarize, density dependent and density independent. Again, here's some examples of density dependent: disease, competition, things like that. The amount of food, water, whatever. Again, they tend to affect populations more as they increase in size. Smaller populations are not affected as much by these. Again, larger populations are affected more by density dependent factors. Density independent, a good example of these are like natural disasters, changes in, let's say, rainfall. Let's say there's a drought or something. I'm even going to throw into this category anthropogenic activities, human-based activities. Again, those things are going to happen regardless of how big populations are. It doesn't really matter. I do want to make sure that you understand one. There's a term here that's kind of an interesting one. It's called a limiting resource. Think about things like water, food, right? These are things that if they're not available, they will limit a population size, right? If they are very available, then populations can get much larger. So it says here it's a resource that a population cannot live without, like water, for example, and that occurs in quantities lower the population would require to increase in size. So, there's always going to be a limit to how much water there is for a population. There's always going to be a limit to how much food there is. But if there is more food and there is more water, for example, if we increase those limiting resources, then populations can grow. But again, these things do limit population growth depending on how much of it there is. All right, now population density. This is a little bit different from size. Oops. Population density is not how many individuals there are necessarily. It's how many individuals there are in a certain area per unit of area. Really good example. This is the state of Virginia. Okay, this was back in 1988. Who cares about the year? But each of these colors or each of these areas here, this is a county in Virginia, and the different colors represent how many deer there are per square mile. So, for example, the areas in green, all these counties, let's say, for example, down here, all these areas or all these counties have less than 15 deer per square mile. Whereas the areas in red, these areas have more than 30 deer per square mile. So, density is how many individuals per unit of area. So if your unit of area is a square mile, you're counting up deer, how many deer there are per square mile. That's what a density is. So, for example, this type of stuff is important when they're like setting like hunting regulations. They might say, well, if you live in these green counties, you can hunt one deer per year, whatever. But if you live in these red counties where there's a heck of a lot more deer and they want to control the deer population, they might say you can hunt two deer per year, whatever. So they set those regulations based on these densities. We can go out, we can actually figure out approximately how many deer there are in these different counties. We do this in Indiana, Illinois, all these states. Population distribution. This is how the population occupies its area. We have three different types: clumped, uniform, and random. You kind of just look at the dots. The dots represent like different individuals in the population. Clumped is by far the most common. This is really common in animal populations. The biggest reason why is there's safety in numbers. There's social interactions going on, mating that goes on, caring for the infants and the babies. Just think about elephants, for example. You don't see elephants just walking around by themselves, right? You usually see them in like herds of 10, 20, 30 elephants, right? So there's a clumping to their distribution. Uniform distribution, this is not as common. It usually happens in plants. And the reason why is because plants aren't mobile, right? They don't move around. So they need space so that they can require resources from the soil. So you usually don't see like these bushes growing like right next to each other. There's usually a few feet apart, and that's usually all because of what's happening underneath the soil. A lot of plants will release chemicals into the soil that will inhibit other plants from growing around them. So this is kind of a uniform type of growth. Then we have random. This happens with some plants as well, like dandelions, for example. It's kind of like grow anywhere. There's not really any rhyme or reason to how they're distributed, but that's just another type of distribution. I would say clumping is probably the most common type, especially amongst animals. Population sex ratios. Sex ratios are basically how many males versus how many females, right? Like, for example, swans, there's usually a 1-to-1 ratio, right? One male for every one female. In a lot of insect populations, like honeybees, for example, there's like 100 males for every one female, right? There's one queen that lives in the hive, and all the males, kind of cater to her and all that type of stuff. So insect populations are a lot different. Sometimes you get sex ratios that change. A real interesting one is frog populations, like frog species. There's been a lot of studies done of frogs in the Midwest, where normally you would think like the sex ratio is a 1-to-1, like one male for every one female. But they're actually seeing frog populations change or sex ratios change. They're seeing a lot of the of frog species, instead of it being one male to one female, they're seeing it like five males to one female. Like the number of females is like dwindling. It's like becoming less and less. And they actually attributed that to road salt, like the salt that you put on the roads in the wintertime. Some of the chemicals that are used in road salt actually affect tadpoles. Like when tadpoles mature, they turn into frogs. Like they found out that some of the chemicals actually inhibit or they stop tadpoles from turning into females, and they turn into males instead. So they're seeing this, instead of it being a 1-to-1 ratio, now it's like a 4 or 5-to-1 male to female ratio. And that's kind of interesting, because if that occurs, then the females are much less common. And that could affect population growth if there's not as many females as there used to be. So, they've gone to lengths now to try to stop a lot of that road salt from getting into local ponds and things like that that might affect these frogs down the road. So, kind of an interesting thing with sex ratio. Finally, this is age structure. We can look at a population, and this one here is of Galapagos tortoises. Those big, huge tortoises that live in the Galapagos Islands are like as big as your, you know, car. They're like massive turtles, or tortoises, not turtles. Turtles have flippers. Tortoises have feet, so there's a difference. Anyway, what this is showing us here is on the y-axis. This is kind of the age of the tortoise. We have like 0 to 20, 21 to 40, etc. Then down here on the X, we have it kind of split. There's males and there's females by percentage. So, for example, let's just look here at 0 to 20. So, of these Galapagos tortoises, if I wanted to know, what percentage of the population are males between the ages of 0 and 20. So you find 0 and 20. You look at males, right? This is the males. And you look at this red bar, right? Red bar over here. I'd say probably about 17, maybe 18% of those tortoises are males between the ages of 0 and 20. Now we can also look at females, right? Between the ages of 0. So now we go over here, right? So according to this red bar, it looks to me like maybe 22, 23% of the population is females between the ages of 0 and 20. So right there, you kind of see a difference, right? Like there seems to be more females than there are males at that age level. You can go up to 21 to 40. 21 to 40 males looks like it's about 15%. Females, it looks like it's about 15%. So it's about even there, right? So you can look at each age level and see what the distribution is, male and female. I mean, but I think it gets really interesting when you get up in here. Say you get above 80 years old, you'll notice that there's a lot more females that are surviving, into those older ages than there are males. So I don't know why that is, but it's interesting when you look at a lot of different animals, you see very similar things. Even humans, we see a lot of human populations. I don't care where it is on the planet, but females tend to have a little bit of a higher life expectancy than males do. And I'll let you guys, kind of think about that and why you think that might be. But it's kind of interesting to explore that and kind of figure out what some of the reasons are for that. All right, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully you watch this. You might want to make sure you watch it again if you haven't have a chance to. All right, I'll talk to you later. See ya. Bye.